Yes, so 10 minutes I've been given now to give some policy pointers. I will not try to cover everything we had in the report, but I will try to make the case for cross-border cooperation and also what taking cross-border cooperation seriously in this area entails in terms of being ready at regional level, having the national frameworks to do this properly. How can you communicate about that with the EU? How could the EU support cross-border cooperation? So these are the kinds of threads I'd like to focus on right now. What is the case? What would be justified to try to promote this notion of competition, which we then arrived at in the report, this combination of competition and cooperation? As Øyvind highlighted, these regions are from a European perspective quite similar. So there is a real risk of a form of a race to the bottom, basically. So the first part of the argument is to mitigate this risk through cross-border cooperation. The other major argument is that you can open entirely new development perspectives through cross-border cooperation. So you can be much stronger in your industrial development strategy. So these two perspectives coexist. The key then is to establish a broad shared understanding of what this implies in practice. So making competition an operational guiding principle in day-to-day activities and not just an empty word, like a nice word, oh, we are how do you say, competition? Well, anyway, we are not cooperating and competing at the same time, and it's a nice principle. I did not manage to find the word, but anyway. So we need to give content to this, and that's what I would like to go into. What does this imply? Well, first, concretely, concrete activities we sketched in our policy pointers under this concept would be, for example, a form of Kvarken Academy, which possibly could be funded by the European Competition Fund, generating shared skill base and coordinating education planning, vocational training, etc. Then there is a notion of communication strategies, a form of branding and changing of self-perceptions in the area, under the heading of a Kvarken Green Industrial Corridor. And the notion of cooperation on backbone infrastructure and innovation ecosystem. So these were the typical activities that would be developed. They would generate effects like economies of scale, enhance synergies. They would lead to maybe more resilient fiber connections, grid reinforcement, etc. But this presupposes that each of the region engaging in this dialogue have a very clear understanding of what they want to be able to have a dialogue with the two other regions on how do you then generate the types of synergies, the types of complementarities that are meaningful. So the starting point is for each of the regional levels to make the strategic choices. Which industries, which doesn't necessarily imply selecting the industries, maybe deciding for one thing if you're going for a very proactive public policy of deciding this is what we as public authorities go for, or if we have a clear strategy of waiting for private initiatives and accompanying the private initiatives that happen to emerge, being clear on what is the choices being made there. It's also essential to think of how this is embedded in intermunicipal ecosystems, labor markets, which are the functional interdependencies, what are the sub-regional patterns of challenge and opportunities? How are these regions different in what kind of structures exist within them? So having a clear territorial perspective on industrial development is also important, and how is each region really clear on how it thinks its regional, sub-regional patterns of industrialization. This, of course, together with getting better at managing risks, of dealing with major industrial investment partners requires administrative capacity building, which interestingly emerged as an idea in the workshop about the possibility of creating regional task force. So maybe some kind of soft power approach in the regions to how they interact with municipalities, coming to them with a task force that can help them in their industrial discussions, and also then putting them in the framework of what is the regional strategy to develop this. So what do we want, and we do this by bringing support to the municipalities. And allowing then for a continuous strategic dialogue between governance levels. in this, all of this pattern, acting quickly emerging, I even mentioned, the window of opportunity linked to the cheap energy is now. And what the major challenge in this whole context is how do you manage to do all of this quickly enough to take advantage of this possibility before it disappears. And our workshops have shown that this only becomes possible if the national framework conditions are adapted. And especially maybe on the Swedish side, we maybe get back to that in panel debates, as amply mentioned that some new perspectives would be needed from the national levels. Major idea is about territorial anchoring of these industrial development processes, saying this is not just about big investors coming in and creating plants, it's about whole communities, whole regions transforming. How can national authorities get a better understanding of this territorial anchoring of processes and how it can be accompanied from national policies, taking this territorial dimension fully into account? Also, the fiscal asymmetries that were mentioned by Øyvind, the fact that localities and regions are taking major risks in the process, but benefits are maybe more occurring at the national level, and how do you get a better balance between between governance levels, basically. This also was especially mentioned in Sweden on how to try to re-establish balances on these respects. And finally, on the valley of death in these capital-intensive, low-carbon industrial projects linked to uncertainties on the return on investments, on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. There are a number of tools emerging across Europe on national instruments emerging to mitigate this risk for the private investments to try to find the right balance. So there are then emerging models for how they should be designed, to make them allocate them competitively, to make them time limited, to embed them in the existing national strategies. We have concrete examples from the German carbon contracts for difference. We have the UK greenhouse gas removals, a number of concrete examples. And we see regional authorities observe that in the absence of such frameworks, there are structural limitations to private investments in these fields. So these needs to be addressed. So the European dimension cannot be ignored. And we also see that we know that we are now preparing for the next programming period. So we have concrete proposals emerging from the discussions in these regions on how the EU could contribute to these industries by acknowledging that if Europe needs these industries, the EU must also help carry the risk. Some of the key policy pointers that emerge are from this perspective, the guiding principles for the dialogue from actors here up to the European levels are about highlighting the Kvarken region's contribution to European strategic autonomy and to green transition, so how this is part of a much broader system of exchanges and of a transformation at European level. The European level can concretely promote cross-border industrial ecosystems, so within the existing frameworks for cross-border cooperation, there is a room of opportunities, a number of opportunities for using existing cross-border instruments much more actively to promote these cross-border industrial ecosystems. And a proactive dialogue is needed to ensure access to EU financing after the end of this programming period, given the entirely new frameworks for allocation of cohesion funding that are emerging, but we'll get back to that in the panel discussions. These were a quick overview of our policy pointers. I hope they gave you some ideas, a starting point for the panel discussions, but then I'll pass on to Kai for the next steps.